Hey guys, and welcome back to A&J Education. In today's video, we're going to talk about the interviews. This video is going to give a broad overview of interviews to America for undergraduate admissions and to interviews for the UK for undergraduate admission. So stay tuned and let's go. Right, okay, so in terms of the interviews, there are basically two main differences between UK and US university interviews. First of all, the main difference is that the American interviews, so let's say you're applying to Stanford or Harvard or Princeton, pretty much everyone is going to receive an interview invitation, especially this year when all of the interviews are done online. So previous years, if you were based in a random country with very few alumni from that university, in some cases you wouldn't get the interview. However, this year it's not a problem. Wherever you are, you're going to get the interview, which is great for you. In the UK, it doesn't quite work like that, and not every university will interview you. In fact, interviews is something that Oxford and Cambridge do for some of the applicants who are shortlisted for the interviews, and a couple other universities as well, such as Imperial, perhaps UCL, St Andrews in some instances, Birmingham, Sheffield. But again, not everyone gets interviewed, and a lot of applicants, a lot of our students get invited to interviews in the UK, and a lot of them do not, and they just either get accepted or rejected straight away. Now, the second, and this is the main difference, is that the interviews in America are fairly chilled, right? So what I mean by that is the interviews are conducted by alumni, hence they're called alumni interviews, and the interview, because American universities carry and gather so much data on you through the Common App or the Coalition application that you're making, or the UC application that you're making, they have so much data on those interviews about you already that the interview is only an extra 1 or 2% of the application overall that they're holding on you, right? So effectively, whether you do really well in an interview or you do really badly isn't going to make or break your application. However, a positive report from an interviewer definitely can make a difference. And crucially, if you're applying to, let's say you're applying for a university in America that's not as competitive as some of the most competitive unis. So instead of, let's say, 20 applicants per place, there are 2 or 3 applicants per place. Now, in those universities, the report from alumni interviewers is actually more used and there is more weighing on this than in universities like Harvard or Stanford. Now, this is anecdotal information. This is what we hear from conversations with admissions officers and looking at certain data points. There isn't a kind of a rule of thumb here, but generally speaking, the more competitive the uni in America you apply to, the less impact your interview will have. So again, treat it with a caution, but as a general rule, that's the case. Now, in the UK, again, a lot of people, in fact, majority of applicants do not get interviews, but you pretty much always get interviewed if you apply for something like medicine or veterinary. And by the way, those of you who watch this channel and know your deadlines will know that medicine, veterinary have an early deadline on 15th of October every year, but those applicants normally get interviewed. And if you apply to Oxford or Cambridge and you're shortlisted for the interview, again, everybody will get interviewed there. Now, assuming you're one of those applicants, the interviews are much harder than the American interviews. American interviews are much more conversational, kind of getting to know you. There is always a question, why are you applying to University X? Tell me about yourself. What do you do with your free time? What are you hoping to do after college? That kind of thing. Just informal chat, get to know you. Now, while there is a stereotype that previously, if you went through one of the great UK public schools and your teacher telephoned the Don in Cambridge and said, look, little Billy is going to come and I highly recommend him, and then Billy comes and, they just have a glass of port with the Don and Billy gets in, or they talk about cricket or whatnot, that doesn't actually happen. So the interviews at Oxbridge or Imperial, whatever university you apply to, if you get one, they tend to be quite intensive. And the interview certainly at Oxbridge is one of the key metrics that Dons make their decisions on, right? So they have your personal statement, they have your teacher's reference, they have your predicted grades, they have the contextualized data. What I mean by that is where your GCSEs, A-levels or predicted IB score sits in relation to other applicants from your school from previous years. So for example, if you're applying with fantastic grades from a school with a relatively poor track record, that's much more impressive than if you're applying from a fantastic grades from a school that's always produce students with fantastic grades. So they have that. They have the extra test, if you're required to sit one, such as an SAA if you're applying for natural sciences to Cambridge, or the TSA, the thinking skills assessment if you're applying for something like PPE at Oxford. So they have that. And if they like all of that, they will invite you for an interview. Now, the interview is not a chat. The only similarity with American interviews is that you're quite likely to be asked the question of why physics, or why philosophy, or why whatever it is you're applying to study. That, my friends, is where the similarities end. And beyond that, it's a heavily academic interview where if you're applying for a science course, they will run you through a set of problems, generally speaking with escalating difficulty. And the idea is that you wouldn't know the solutions right away because, assuming you have an interview at Oxford or Cambridge, you're a high achieving student, you're good at your A levels or schoolwork, and they're not interested in knowing what you know. Rather, they're interested in giving you information that you wouldn't have seen before and then seeing how you respond to that information. So this is, in a way, a great equalizer because different students come from different educational backgrounds. Some do A level, some do IB, some go to private sector, some go to state sector. But you can still win regardless of the odds if you just prepare, if you bear in mind the style and the approach of the questions that will be asked at Oxbridge interviews. We're going to do a separate video on that, so stay tuned for that. Now, this is a very different style of interviews to America, which is just much more relaxed and more of a conversation. Now, if you totally screw up your interview in America, chances are, if you're a good applicant of a role, if you have fantastic essays, fantastic references, decent school transcript, and decent test score, if you are required to submit one, you will probably still get in, or at least your chances will not be as affected. However, if you bomb your interview at Oxford or Cambridge, or let's say you're applying to Imperial and they interview you there and you completely cock up the interview, you're pretty much screwed. Because the interviews are given so much more weight in the admissions process in the UK than in America, if you cock this one up, you're pretty much finished. So you kind of have to expect that it's not going to work out. Now, on a more positive note, if you think that you've screwed it up and you've had a really bad day at interviews, generally speaking, that's a good sign. And students who go to interviews and who leave the interviews thinking that it was fairly easy and it went well, that normally means that they haven't pushed you as hard. And this means that they perhaps can indicate that they've identified that you're not quite good enough for them. And so instead of pushing you, why kind of make it difficult for themselves? They just gave you a fairly chilled, relaxing conversation. Now, if you leave your interview in tears and you had a really bad day, well, it can mean that you really have screwed up, or it can mean that they've pushed you because they've identified potential and they wanted to push you until you finally cracked. So that's not necessarily a bad thing, and that's, for example, what happened in my interviews when the questions kept getting harder and harder and harder, and I really struggled, and I thought that I've I didn't do well, but clearly they saw something. And what I subsequently learned is that there was a sequence of questions that was getting harder and harder for them to identify the breaking point. And speaking to other students, not every student would get the same questions because some students, again, would progress slower through the interview and there was a set amount of time. So by the time some students already reach kind of the hardest questions, others are still stuck on the easy ones. And again, they feel like the interview is going better, but it's not actually a very good sign. Anyways, I hope this has been useful. Remember, the main differences between UK and American interviews is that American interviews pretty much guaranteed to every applicant, whilst the UK interviews are not. American interviews are done by alumni, whilst UK interviews are done by professional admissions officers. American interviews can subtract a little bit from your application, whilst UK interviews are a pretty major component of the overall application. And lastly, American interviews are much more conversational and a fairly simple chat, whilst UK interviews are very academic and want to really find out your academic ability. Anyways, I hope this was useful. Good luck in your interviews. Let us know in the comments how they go. The interview season is well underway, and best of luck. Take care.